Greetings students, I am Dr. Shubhradev Bishwash, Associate Professor with the Department of ENT IPG MER. Today I am going to present a virtual class on facial nerve, a discussion in ENT. These are the list of the important questions that you will be facing during your theory and practical. Facial nerve is a very important nerve. It is considered the seventh cranial nerve. It is also considered a mixed nerve. Why it is considered a mixed nerve? Because it carries both the motor supply as also the sensory and secretory motor supply to the peripheral end organ. Sensation it carries from the peripheral end organ onto the brain. So what are the components of the facial nerve that makes it a mixed nerve? First is the spatial visceral efferent. Efferent meaning when the sensation is getting carried from the brain peripherally onto the affected organs, here in this case the muscles developing from the second pharyngeal arch. So this forms the motor component. The next components are the general visceral efferent. Here the parasympathetic secretomotor fibers are getting carried from the superior salivatory nucleus onto the glands of the lacrimal, nasal, palatine, as also the submandibular and the sublingual secretory glands. To note, parotid is not supplied by the facial nerve. Parotid, though through the parotid the facial nerve is traversing, the secretomotor function of the parotid nerve is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve. Next are the efferents. Efferents meaning the sensation is getting carried from the end organs up to the brain. Where do they end? They end in the nucleus tractus solitarius. Here it ends in the superior salivatory nucleus. Here it ends in the motor nucleus. And also the general somatic afferents, that is the cutaneous sensation from around the concha, the posterior part of the external auditory canal and the tympanic membrane, they also get carried to the nucleus tractus solitarius. So one is a motor fiber that arises separately from the brainstem. Another is this part which carries the sensation from the peripheral part to the brain, as also the secretomotor fibers from the brain to the periphery. This has got a different entity that comes out differently through a separate route from the brain and is called the nervus intermedius or the nerve of Risberg. The two nerves, they travel separately only to unite after they have entered into the temporal bone. So the intracranial part of the facial nerve, the two parts are traveling separately. For the purpose of MCQ, I hereby orient you about something that is different. So what is the spatial somatic afferent? It is not carried by facial. Which sensations are carried by this spatial somatic afferent? It is only the optic nerve carrying the fibers for the vision, as also the eighth cranial nerve carrying impulses for the body balance, as also the hearing apparatus. So this is not carried by the facial. Just for the purpose of the MCQs that you may face in the future, I hereby alert you. So this thing is for certain. Facial nerve is a mixed nerve that has components of motor supplying the second pharyngeal nerve, the components collectively that supplies the Secretomotor fibers as also carries the taste sensation from periphery to the brain, collectively traveling through the nervous intermediaries, both together, though initially separate in the brain and the initial part of the temporal bone, they finally unite within the temporal part of the bone to form a single nerve that comes out to supply the different components of the face as also the secretomotor as also the taste functions. Now this next slide. Slide is mostly about the motor component. The motor component has got a supranuclear part, a nucleus of the facial nerve, and then the infranuclear part. So supranuclear part, where is it located? The supranuclear part is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. This controls the nucleus of the facial nerve. And how does it control? The next slide. Suppose, see, this is my precentral gyrus, the superior nucleus, the supranuclear part of the facial nerve. Whom does it supply? It supplies right upper face. It also supplies the right upper face, but only the left lower face. It doesn't supply the ipsilateral lower face. Similarly, the opposite side, the left side will be supplying both the upper part of the nucleus, upper face nucleus, but only the contralateral part of the nucleus, or only contralateral part of the lower part of the face. So in such a situation, if suddenly there is a stroke or CVA, suppose of the right side, what will go? This will go. This will go. This will go, as also this will go. So what remains? This remains. What remains? This remains. So what is spared? This is spared because it is getting supplied from the opposite side. What is spared? This is spared because it is supplied from the ipsilateral side. What goes? This part goes. This part goes because it is only supplied by the contralateral side. So if there is a CVA of the precentral gyrus, the superior nuclear part of the facial nerve, what will happen? The upper part up to the orbicularis oculi of the face will be contracting. What goes is the contralateral side, the lower part of the face. So there will be no movement onto the lower part of the face on the contralateral side, whereas the upper part of the face will be preserved. Why the upper part of the face will be preserved? Because it is receiving the supply from the ipsilateral side. So if you are getting a patient who is having a normal movement of the forehead as also the orbicularis oculi muscle, but no movement downwards, you are sure that the event or something has occurred in the precentral gyrus, a CVA, a tumor or something. An event has occurred in the precentral gyrus, the supranuclear part of the nerve has gone, and hence we get such a situation. But something very strange about this. Remember, thalamus is responsible for the emotion. This is controlling both the part of the face. So a face which is having a paralysis of the supranuclear type, that is the lower part of the face is gone, suddenly when the patient is smiling, laughing or is crying, you will be noticing facial movements returning to the paralyzed side. So this is a process where the thalamus is bypassing the damaged pericentral gyrus and is bringing back the muscular movement in the paralyzed side. So, if there is a precentral gyrus lesion, there will be normal movement of the forehead as also the orbicularis oculi with loss of function of the lower part of the face, and suddenly the lower part of the face will be twitching, will be adequately responding when the patient is suddenly bursting out in laughter or is emotionally crying out. So thalamus is the savior in such a situation, which allows a patient of supranuclear palsy to cry and laugh with proper facial expression even though he is not having any expression into the lower part of the face in the contralateral side to the side which has undergone a damage. So this is a description of how the facial nerve is originating. So facial nerve nucleus, the motor nucleus, is originating just above the pontomedullary junction. Here, from here it is originating. How is it originating? It is making a loop. It is making a loop around the abducens nucleus, making a bulge onto the fourth ventricle, and that bulge is called the facial colliculus. If due to certain occurration or due to certain situation there is a CV in this region, commonly the facial nerve muscle movement goes together with the loss of abducens nerve movement, the paralysis of the lateral rectus. So if there is a suddenly severe lesion in the site where the facial nerve motor component is taking its origin, there is high chance that together with the motor nucleus, the abducens nerve nucleus will also be getting damaged together because it is forming a turn around the abducens nerve nucleus. And this turn, this genu-like turn, is called the internal genu of the facial nerve. But I have told that facial nerve is not fully formed by the motor component of the facial nerve. It is also carrying sensation, for the taste sensation, also the cutaneous sensation. And where does it end up? It ends up in the upper part of the nucleus tractus solitarius, which is located in the upper part of the medullus. And the secretory part? In the secretory part, the efferent is originating from the superior part of the superior salivatory nucleus into the pons. The upper part is supplying the seventh cranial nerve, and the lower part is supplying the glossopharyngeal nerve. So out from here and here, the nerve that will be joining together will be forming the nervus intermedius or the nerve of Reisberg. After the facial nerve comes out, what happens? The first nerve, after the facial nerve comes out, it travels through some intracranial course till it enters the internal auditory meatus. From the internal auditory meatus, it enters the labyrinthine part, all within the temporal bone. After it comes out the labyrinthine part, it makes a bend. This is the first genu, also called the external genu. You remember that we have already mentioned about the internal genu that is located close to the motor nucleus in the pons region. And after it comes out from the labyrinthine part, it gives its first branch, which is the greater superficial petrosoma. What does it carry? It carries presympathetic fibers, the preganglionic fibers, the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. Where does it reach? It reaches onto through the Vidian canal, it reaches onto the pterygopalatine or sphenopalatine ganglion. And from there, the postganglionic fibers via the trigeminal nerve will be reaching the lacrimal, the nasal, and the palatine glands. Interestingly, this nerve is joined by the sympathetic supply that is arising from around the carotid nerve, the sympathetic plexus that is forming the deep petrosal nerve. The deep petrosal nerve, as also the greater superficial petrosal nerve, they travel through the Vidian canal into the sphenopalatine ganglion. There is a clinical condition called vasomotor rhinitis, where there is excessive parasympathetic secretomotor function. There is also a sympathetic function, but that sympathetic function is much minimal. The normal sympathetic function is much minimal comparing to the hyperactive parasympathetic function. So, what is the symptom that this patient is having? He is having rhinitis, that is continuous runny nose. The patient is getting irritated, he is having a runny nose, his noses are getting blocked. So, he comes to you. Previously, there was a common surgery where we used to do a Vidian neurectomy. So, we cut this nerve. What goes? Goes the greater superficial petrosal nerve as also the sympathetic branch. So, it is becomes neutral. The hyperactive parasympathetic motor fibers, they are lost, as also the sympathetic fibers are lost. This is a neutral position. So, the vasomotor rhinitis situation is getting improved. But these days, this Vidian neurectomy is not done. Why is it not done? Because as a byproduct of Vidian neurectomy, what you get are the dry eyes, the xerophthalmia. So, lifelong this patient will be needing eye drops as a maintenance. So, for a gain, what you are losing is something more. If you don't continue with these eye drops, exposure keratitis or dry eyes will be having, the patient will be having a lot of other discomforters and comorbidities. So, nowadays, Vidian neurectomy is never done. Next comes the nerve to the stapedius after it crosses the second genu. Where is the second genu located? Just the horizontal part of the tympanic nerve turns into a vertical component of the tympanic nerve in between the lateral semicircular canal and the oval window. Just as it crosses, it gives out the nerve to the stapedius. The stapedius muscle, what is its function? Whenever there is a loud noise, the noise is going to produce enough energy to push the stapes right into the inner ear, thereby causing acoustic damage of the inner ear. Body has devised a mechanism to stop it. So, whenever there is a loud sound, this nerve is getting stimulated. And what happens? The stapedius muscle is pulling out the superstructure of stapes so that it doesn't deeply enter into the oval window, thereby causing any damage. It is the body's natural defense mechanism to prevent a damage to the hearing of our ear. So, this is the function of the nerve to stapedius. Next comes the cauda tympani nerve. Cauda tympani nerve has got two functions. It has got the preganglionic, parasympathetic, secretomotor fibers that is destined to supply the submandibular and the sublingual gland. After it has, it is not going to, it is only going to end to the submandibular ganglion, from where the trigeminal nerve will be supplying the secretomotor fibers to these respective glands. The other important function of cauda tympani, the most important function to the cauda tympani is the taste sensation. It carries taste sensation from the tongue as also the palate. So, these are the dual function of the cauda tympani. Next is, after it comes out through the stylomastoid foramen, it is going to give a post auricular nerve which is going to supply the occipital branch of the occipital frontalis, as also the muscles of the pinna. Then the nerves of the posterior belly of the digastric, nerve to stylohyoid, and then comes the most interesting part of the facial nerve as it traverses through the face in between the parotid superficial lobe and the deep lobe to supply the muscles of the facial expression. Remember, the facial nerve doesn't create a plane in between the deep and the superficial part of the facial nerve. As it travels to the parotid gland, the parotid gland itself divides into the superficial and the deep lobe depending on the plane through which the facial nerve is passing. And see how it looks? It looks like the foot of a duck, which is called the pes enceladinus. Now the course of the facial nerve. Crudely, the course of the facial nerve is divided into three parts. One is the intercranial part, next is the intratemporal part, third is the extracranial part as it comes out of the stylomastoid foramen and traverses the face, supplying mostly the muscles developing from the second pharyngeal arch or the muscles of the facial expression. Being surgeons, we come across mostly these two parts. As a ENT surgeons, these two parts are very much important to us. The intercranial part, after it comes out from the pontomedullary junction until it reaches the internal auditory meatus, the length is 15 to 17 millimeter. The intratemporal part starts from the medial part of the internal auditory meatus. In the internal auditory meatus, the meatal segment traversing over 10 millimeters ends in the fundus of the internal auditory meatus from where the labyrinthine part starts. Labyrinthine part is very important. Not only is the shortest part of the tympanic membrane, but it is also the narrowest part, having a diameter of 0.68 millimeter. Why this narrowness of the diameter is very important? Because within the shell of the bone, this nerve has got minimum space. So if there is a sudden edema of the nerve in this part of the facial nerve, it is where there is a maximum chance of the nerve getting compressed. So if there is a viral inflammation or inflammation of any part, any cause where the nerve is getting inflamed, swollen, this is the part where there is a maximal chance that the nerve is going to get compressed. Next is the tympanic or the horizontal segment. The labyrinthine part, after it ends, it gives rise to the first genu that carries the geniculate ganglion. From the geniculate ganglion up to the second genu is the tympanic segment having a length of around 11 millimeter. From there arises the vertical segment till it comes out of the stylomastoid foramen, which is called the mastoid or the vertical segment. And then is the extracranial part. The extracranial part we mostly come across while we are operating on the patient for parotid conditions like pleomorphic adenoma, Woodin's tumor, or any malignancy of the parotid gland. There are high chances that during the performance of the surgery, the extracranial part of the facial nerve may get damaged, causing a disfiguring facial paralysis of the patient, a cosmetic problem that may land up the surgeon in severe litigations. So while doing a parotid surgery, we take a permission for facial nerve damage and we remain utmost careful while operating for a parotid nerve tumors. Also, the intertemporal part becomes important to us when we are doing a mastoid surgery. Mastoid surgeries are done in cases of mastoiditis, cholesteatoma, which the other teachers have definitely covered you. what we do, we remove the mastoid antrum. We exteriorize the mastoid antrum and we remove the posterior bony meatal wall up till the facial nerve, that is the vertical part of the facial nerve. And while doing this surgery, we also remove the attic also. So while doing this surgery, while working within the mastoid bone, there is high chance that we may end up damaging the facial nerve. So we have to remain very careful while operating for a mastoid surgery, taking good care about the facial nerve and its course through the intertemporal part. As also while doing a parotid surgery, we need to be very careful about the extracranial facial nerve. This is the elaboration of the extracranial facial nerve. After it comes out from the stylomastoid foramen, it typically divides into two branches. One is the temporocervical, temporofacial, and another is the cervicofacial. The temporofacial and the cervicofacial subsequently develops into the temporal and zygomatic branch, the temporofacial. The buccal, mandibular, and the cervical branch comes out from the cervicofacial branch. These nerves, they have intense intercommunications between them, except for the marginal mandibular nerve. So, even if a nerve, suppose the buccal or the zygomatic or the temporal nerve, gets damaged, due to this tremendous intercommunication, there are high chances that with time the patient may get back the facial muscle movements back. But marginal mandibular nerve is minimally supplied by the intercommunications. So if you have to be very careful while dealing with this very delicate nerve, if the muscle movement goes, what goes is the deviation of, there will be a failure of the deviation of the angle of the mouth, and this cosmetic deformity will be permanent. You may end up damaging the buccal singularly, or the zygomatic or the temporal. The functions may return in the long run, but if it is a marginal mandibular nerve, the chances that the function will return in the long run are minimal. These are the list of the muscles that are supplied by the facial nerve. As it comes out from the stylomastoid foramen, as it divides into the different branches, it looks like the duck foot, earning it the name of the pes anserinus. These are the branches of the facial nerve once again. The greatest superficial petrosal nerve. What does it supply? It supplies as the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers meant for the lacrimal, nasal, and the palatine glands. Nerves to stapedius. The stapes muscle is getting supplied by this nerve. Chorda tympani. It carries the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers, as also it carries the taste sensation. Chromatic branch, which joins the nerve of vagus, supplying the concha, the posterior external auditory canal, as also the external part of the tympanic membrane. A very interesting sign that may come in your MCQ, or a good scoring students may be asked, is the Hirschelberger sign. What is Hirschelberger sign? Hirschelberger sign typically happens when there is a compression of the nerve at the region of the CP angle, at the region of the internal auditory meatus, the medial end. Suppose there is a vestibular schwannoma that is gradually enlarging in size and causing a compression on the facial nerve. What will happen? This communicating branch is going to get jeopardized, and if you scratch at the posterior part of the external auditory canal, the sensation will be getting diminished. So somehow, if you find in a case of a suspected patient suspecting of a vestibular schwannoma, if you are finding that there is a diminished sensation in the posterior canal wall of the external auditory meatus while scratching, it is said to be a positive Hirschelberger sign, and it is a sign that points towards a possibility of vestibular schwannoma. Then there is a postauricular nerve. Which part of the, which nerve muscles does it supply? It supplies mostly the pinna muscles, as also the occipital belly of the occipital frontalis. Then the muscular branches supplying the stylohyoid and the posterior belly of the digastric, and then the peripheral branches supplying the muscles of the facial expression, which are very important once you are doing the parotid surgery. Blood supply. If you are given a long question on the facial nerve, mostly you end up saying only about the crude anatomy, leaving out the blood supply. Blood supply should always be mentioned. It is very important. This blood supply is also important because it also in a way alerts the surgeon against committing a facial nerve damage while doing mastoid surgery. How? First, let us discuss what are the blood supply to the facial nerve. The part of the intracranial part is supplied by the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Then comes the internal auditory meatus part, which is supplied by the labyrinthine artery. The superficial petrosal artery is supplying the part around the first genu or the geniculate ganglion. Then the vertical and the tympanic part of the facial nerve is supplied by the stylomastoid artery. These arteries, they form a plexus. One is the external plexus, that is around the epicranium, and another is the internal plexus. Now imagine a surgeon who is working very close to the facial nerve. He is gradually removing the bone, the bony covering of the facial nerve, and suddenly he finds a soft tissue with a leash of blood vessels covering it. Once he becomes alert that this soft tissue can be nothing else but the facial nerve with its list of external plexus of blood vessels, and he becomes alert, he becomes careful not to damage the nerve. So what are the landmarks that keeps our surgeons safe? Usually we mostly work in the middle ear cleft. The middle ear cleft carries a few well documented landmarks. First is the processus cochleariformis, a pulley on which the tensor tympani muscle loops. It is a very resistant landmark that rarely gets destroyed by the disease and forms an important landmark for identifying the geniculate ganglion from where the tympanic segment of the facial nerve originates. It lies anterior to it. The next landmark lies between the lateral semicircular canal and the oval window with its stapes superstructure. The oval window is a bit lateral to the facial nerve. So once you find the lateral semicircular canal and also the oval window, you can predict the plane through which the facial nerve is passing. The next landmark is the short process of the incus. Here is a diagram. See, this is my adductus to the antrum, where it shows the short process of the incus, and this facial nerve is somewhat medial, running medial to the short process of the processus trochleariformis. Then comes the pyramid. Facial nerves rise immediately behind the pyramid. It lies behind the tympanomastoid suture and also the digastric suture, the anterior end of the digastric suture. What is digastric suture? You know what is the posterior belly of the digastric? It makes a impression onto the mastoid tip, and it leads to our facial nerve as it is coming out from the stylomastoid foramen. So these are the landmarks that guides, that protects the surgeon against committing any injury of the intertemporal part of the facial nerve. And then comes the parotid surgery. The parotid surgery, after you have taken up the flap of the face, is called the modified Blair incision. What remains below is the facial nerve. What remains below is the parotid gland, the superficial lobe. You have to hunt for the facial nerve as it comes out from the stylomastoid foramen, forming a trunk before it separates into two major trunks, the temporofacial and the cervicofacial. So this trunk you need to identify, or else you will end up damaging the facial nerve. Who will tell you where it lies? Obviously, the God has given the surgeon a few potential landmarks that will help the surgeon to identify where is lying the facial nerve as it is coming out from the stylomastoid foramen. First, after you have skeletonized the tragus, meaning the triangular cartilage that is lying anterior to the external auditory canal, you have skeletonized the cartilage, and this cartilage is actually pointing towards the facial nerve, but not actually, but actually it is located a bit deeper, a bit anterior and inferior to the tragal pointer. So tragal pointer or the cartilaginous pointer is our first landmark. Next is the tympanomastoid suture. As you place your finger behind your mandible and your mastoid tip, the suture that you can palpate even on your own ear is the tympanomastoid suture. So after you have skeletonized the part, the facial nerve will be lying deep to it at a depth of 6 to 8 millimeter. The stylet process and the posterior belly of the digastric. In between these two, the facial nerve will be egressing from the stylomastoid foramen. So this is another landmark that will help you to guide. Suppose in a distorted anatomy, when the patient has undergone a previous surgery and you are going in for a revision surgery, maybe all these landmarks are jeopardized, all these landmarks are fibrosed. Then there may be another method of identifying this trunk of facial nerve. What it is? It is the retrograde approach. Suppose you, after lifting the flap of the face, you can locate peripherally any of the branches of the facial nerve, be it mandibular, be it buccal, be it zygomatic, be it temporal, be it cervical. So any nerve you find out, and from there you trace it backwards towards the trunk of the facial nerve, and definitely you will be finding the trunk of the facial nerve. And from there again, if you trace out, it will be gradually, it is time taking, it is tedious, but gradually you will be finding all the other branches of the facial nerve. So this is another tedious, less followed but possible method of identifying the trunk of the facial nerve, and these are the surgical landmarks that help a surgeon to identify its facial nerves, thereby preventing himself for causing any cosmetic damage to his patient. Variations. What we have talked about are the normal anatomy, but not all people are same, and obviously not all facial nerves are same. They have got their individual variations. How? The most problematic for a surgeon is a dehiscent facial nerve. By the term dehiscent, what we mean is that it's not having its usual bony covering. So nerve is covered only by its epineurium. So the epineurium is the part that is actually separating the nerve from the surgeon. And if accidentally a rotating bar that is used to drill out the mastoid bone touches this nerve, immediately you will be getting a facial nerve paralysis. Dehiscent nerve is most commonly found in the tympanic or the horizontal segment of the facial nerve close to the oval window. It can also be found in the region of the geniculate ganglion and also the vertical part. This dehiscent facial nerve may also prolapse over the stapes footplate. And there what happens, if the patient is having an otosclerosis and the surgeon is planning to do a stepidotomy or stapedectomy, after doing a tympanotomy or entering into the middle ear, he suddenly discovers that there is a facial nerve sitting on the sitting on the oval window. In such a situation, the surgeon has got no option but to abandon the procedure to avoid any damage to the facial nerve. These days, to avoid this embarrassment of attempting a surgery and coming out a failure, many surgeons are routinely doing a CT scan to assess the relation of the oval window with that of the facial nerve before contemplating a surgery. You may also get a hump. At the region of the lateral semicircular canal, a hump may form, and this hump, if you are not aware, the sudden jump of the facial nerve away from the course towards the lateral semicircular canal may end up the surgeon in damaging it. Bifurcation and trifurcation in the vertical segment of the facial nerve is not much of a problem. If it at all happens, it remains covered within the bone. Occasionally, the individual divisions they travel through their own canals, and these are rare conditions. I personally haven't found a single situation, so these are less problematic. But again, then a bifurcation of the facial nerve and that is enclosing the stapes is again going to cause a problem to a surgeon who is contemplating autosclerosis surgery on the patient. Occasionally, in very rare condition, a nerve that is coming out from the labyrinthine part is very lazy to travel from the first genu to second genu and from the second genu to the stylomastoid foramen. In, in such a situation, what it does, it travels directly in a diagonal pathway from the first genu onto the stylomastoid foramen across the promontory. So these are the variations that may happen to your facial nerve. Being a surgeon, you should be cautious about all of them. The structure of the facial nerve, the microscopic structure of the facial nerve, or more importantly, what covers from the facial nerve from inside out. First, let us begin from the axon itself. The axon is getting covered by the myelin sheath. Then comes the neurolemma, and then the first connective tissue covering, that is the endoneurium. The endoneurium, a bunch of the facial nerves together with covered by the endoneurium, is covered by the perineurium, each forming a vesicle. And the whole lot of the facial nerve is covered together by the epineurium. Remember, I had already told you this epineurium is having a plexus of the external plexus of the blood vessels that is going to alert the surgeon if he has come very close to the facial nerve. So first is the endoneurium, second is the perineurium that together forms the fascicle of the nerve, and lastly the most superficial covering of the facial nerve is the epineurium. And why is this important? Is in the next classification, is the next slide. A facial nerve may get damaged. There are lots of reasons that may end up damaging the facial nerve. It may be a viral infection, it may be a inflammation, it may be a road traffic accident, a trauma, or a iatrogenic trauma, that is a trauma caused by the surgeon. And whenever this happens, the most disturbing feature that will happen to the patient is the facial asymmetry, a cosmetic deformity, a patient having no movement of the side of the face. And this is a disaster. Just imagine a young girl whose life may be thoroughly shattered if suddenly one part of the facial nerve face is not moving. So we have to predict which nerve, which is the what is the extent of the injury, and also the which nerve will return to its normal function fully or partially, as also we'll have to identify those cases which on its own will never ever return to its normal function. So we have classified where depending on the intensity of the injury into different grades. One has classified as neuropraxia, axonotmesis, and neurotmesis. Another, the Sunderland classified it as grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5, depending on the severity of the injury of the facial nerve. So, what are the grades? First grade is the grade 1, which is the neuropraxia. Why does it happen? In the neuropraxia, maximally either there is a flow of there is blockade in the flow of the exoplasm, or maximally there is a damage to the myelin covering of the nerve. It is the most internal nerve. Remember, the endoneural tubes are intact. So whenever the nerve will be regenerating, or there is a flow back of the exoplasm, nothing has happened, the channels are same, so there is no problem with this type of facial nerve damage. Commonly, where do we find it? Suppose we are doing a thyroid surgery and there is too much stretching of the thyroid gland while we are delivering it, and immediately post-operatively we find the recurrent laryngeal paralysis in the form of vocal cord function gone to that side. But the next morning, surprisingly and happily, we find that the voice has returned with absolutely normal movement of the vocal cord. So this condition is a condition of neuropraxia, perhaps due to excessive pulling or stretching of the nerve. There had happened a flow of exoplasm got blocked, or maximally there is a myelin damage which soon recovers, and these cases don't pose a problem for the surgeon. But suppose the extent of injury is a bit more, where the endoneurium is lost, where the axonal damage is present, where we call it the axonotmesis. Here the axons are lost, but still the endoneurium is present. It is normal. So in the grade 2 also, it will return. Maybe it will be taking a bit more time than grade 1, but it will definitely return. Next comes beyond the axon, it is the endoneurium that is getting damaged. So once the endoneurium is getting damaged, it is not happening singularly, it is happening collectively within the fascicle, where the perineurium is normal. What happens is, suppose a nerve muscle that was nerve fiber that was supposed to go from the brain to the eyes, when they regenerate, they grow into a endoneural tube, a tube that was supposed to carry fiber to the muscle of angle of the mouth contraction. So a communication is established from the pre-damaged part to the post-damaged part in both the muscle containing the orbiculus operculi, as also the muscle controlling the contraction of the angle of the mouth. In such a situation, what you get is a synkinesis. Synkinesis means that you, while closing the eyes, suddenly there is a movement of the angle of the mouth. For example, you close the eyes and you find that the angle of the mouth is getting twitched or pulled up. So, a volitional movement with a involuntary movement free at the trying of the voluntary movement. So, this is called a synkinesis, and you get when there is a endoneural damage. When there is a endoneural damage that together with a perineural damage, we call that a grade 4. The grade 3 is also the neurotmesis, where is a division of the nerve. Yeah, there is partial transection of the nerve in the grade 4. Here, how much it will repair, what will be the consequence, is a bit uncertain. This is a challenging condition for the surgeon to identify and to assess whether a surgical intervention is needed or not. And stage 5, all the layers are gone and it is a complete transaction. Definitely, this nerve either won't heal, either won't regain its function, or it will very poorly regain its function. And definitely, this condition, when diagnosed, requires a immediate surgical intervention so as to expect a good recovery of the facial nerve function. So once again, neuropraxia is a transient block, axonotmesis is a lesion in continuity, but these have got a good prognosis, whereas neurotmesis, where there is a division of the nerve, a surgeon has to assess, has to evaluate whether to intervene surgically as also when to intervene. So how do we know whether to intervene and when to intervene? Obviously, before we go, how to know when and where to intervene? This is a grading of the facial paralysis. A person has presented to you with a facial paralysis and you need to record it in writing. You may present a descriptive writing, but House Brackman has evolved taking cue from the primary easily identifiable movements of the facial nerve, and he has graded the facial nerve paralysis from grade 1 to grade 6, ranging from absolutely normal to total paralysis. So what is a grade 2 paralysis? It is a very mild paralysis where there is all more or less normal. The patient is closing the eyes with some effort, not a big effort. He is easily closing the eyes. On smiling, there is some asymmetry, not much. And the forehead, there is a reasonable function. You usually will be missing unless you have got a very trained eye. Next is a moderate. These patients will be easily identifiable. When the face is normal, you can notice nothing. But when the patient is trying to close his eyes, he is giving full effort, he is giving extreme effort to achieve full closure of the eyeball. Remember, up to this stage, eye closure is possible. Beyond this stage, eye closure is not possible. There is asymmetry of the angle of the mouth. When the mouth is being pulled, it is having some deformity, and forehead is also having some slight to moderate movement. Still the function is there. 4 is moderately severe. At rest, the facial asymmetry is normal. There is no asymmetry, but this is the first stage where eyes are not closing. So stage 4 is if you find even with maximal effort the eyes are not closing, either it is a stage 4 or it is a stage 5, and it is a stage 6. So in between the three, the diagnosis lies. The angle of the mouth is not rising even fully, even with its maximum effort, and there is no movement of the forehead of the eye. If you elevate your upper lids upwards, there is no movement even with the maximal effort. Severe is the fifth grade. In the normal resting situation, the facial asymmetry is more or less observable. Obviously, with maximal effort, there is no eye closure. Angle of the mouth is still having some movement. So it is the last part to go. Angle of the mouth is last part to go. You are asking the patient to smile. Still there is some movement, but there is no movement of the forehead. So the forehead goes in the fourth. Uh, Last part to go is the in the fifth is the mouth, and sixth is the total paralysis when no function is present in any part of the face. Now here a patient has presented to you with facial nerve paralysis. Being a surgeon, you are at a dilemma whether to operate. Also, you need to know where to operate. The first comes whether to operate. Obviously, you had learned that in cases of neuropraxia, the nerve is going to heal on its own. It will be taking a few days maximum for the return of the nerve function. So these cases don't pose a problem. The more severe cases, that is grade 3 to grade 5, are the problematic. What are the armarium of electrodiagnostic tests that we have? First is the minimal nerve excitability test. First can be done almost about 48 to 72 hours. What we do? We gradually increase the facial nerve stimulation, expecting the first twitch of facial muscle. And then we get the first twitch of the facial muscle in the normal as also in the abnormal side. Obviously, you may not get any twitch in the abnormal side also, but you may also get. And we measured the amount of electrical stimulus that had been given to achieve the first sign of electrical stimulation. If there is a difference of 3.5 milliampere, you know that the degeneration of the facial nerve has already set in. Next is the maximal stimulation test. It is similar to the minimal stimulation test, but here you are giving the supra threshold, the maximum amount of stimulation that the patient can tolerate to have a maximal effect of facial contraction. So the benchmark is that you must be having the maximum contraction of the facial muscle. You compare it also with the normal side, and you measure the amount of current that you require to produce this maximal stimulation, and also you need to record in the affected side whether it is equal, it is reduced, or it is absent. Equal means that there is no degeneration, but if it is significantly reduced or absent, you can obviously know that there is a degeneration has set in. But whether a surgeon needs to operate, the most important test is your electroneuronogram. The electroneuronogram records the compound action potential of the facial muscle on being stimulated. A suprathreshold stimulus is given at the root of the facial, at the stem of the facial nerve as it comes out from the stylomastoid foramen, and the compound action potentials are recorded from the facial muscles close to the nasal ala. 4th to 21st days is the period where this nerve is most important. In certain facial nerve paralysis, they are done on the alternate days to determine whether to intervene and when to intervene. If you find that there is a rapid degeneration of the facial nerve is going on, that carries a poor prognosis and you need to act first. If by 14th day there is a degeneration of 90% of the facial nerve, the degeneration is setting and definitely the surgeon needs to intervene. But if the degeneration is less than 25%, you can jolly well expect a good recovery of the facial nerve. Complementary to the electroneuronogram is the electromyogram. It takes about normally the nerve has got at 30 to 50 millisecond it has got a biphasic or the triphasic potential, and if the facial nerve becomes paralyzed, what happens it more about by about 14 days, what happens is that you get a fibrillation potential. So that is a chaotic potential. Just like a chaotic class where the students are roaming around because there is no teacher or no control of the nerve, a teacher like nerve on the rowdy students. So the students are roaming around. There is no regularity in this potential, but still the muscle is alive. It will contract if stimulated. And if suddenly you are starting to get polyphasic reinnervation potential, you may expect that by 6 to 12, within the 6 to 12 weeks, the nerve function may recover. Suppose you have got a patient at the end of 1 year from the onset of the facial paralysis, and you determine that yes, I want to operate on this patient, I do want to do a procedure on this patient, and you do a electromyogram. What you find, to your pleasure, you find a polyphasic reinnervation potential. In this patient, you shouldn't be operating, for chances that the facial nerve function will be returning on its own is quite high. But if the facial nerve is has got degenerated, there is no, but there is a there is also no though there is no also action potential, there is no potential into the muscles, there is no response in the muscles, you know that this muscle has gone atrophy. So even if you stimulate this muscle with any nerve, suppose by transfer of nerve, or you reinnervate the facial nerve with a hypoglossal or any other nerve, as you can see here, this patient won't benefit. But if you are finding that there is certain potential activity within the muscle nerve fibers, a reinnervation will help in getting back some function of the facial nerve. For example, here what we do, the end-to-end anastomosis, here the hypoglossal nerve is put like this and is communicated with this part of the facial nerve. So for this to happen, even though the nerve is unresponsive, there should be some action potential happening, there should be some resting potential happening within the muscle for the muscle to respond any stimulation that may come from the hypoglossal nerve. These are the causes of the facial palsy. It can be central, it can be intracranial, intertemporal, infections, trauma, neoplasia, extracranial part, the malignancy of the parotid and other tumors of the parotid, and also the systemic disease. Of this, I am going to discuss a few important topics. And definitely the first topic that comes to my mind is the Bell's palsy. Why shouldn't it be also? It is the most common cause of facial nerve paralysis in the patients. Almost 60 to 65% of facial nerve paralysis is actually due to Bell's palsy. It is a idiopathic condition. During my student days, we used to laugh at this term of idiopathic. We used to say it is idiotic for the doctor who cannot diagnose the cause of the disease, and pathetic for the patient because the patient doesn't know what has happened to him, why it has happened, and if you don't know why is it happened, obviously you cannot also offer him a good treatment. So it is an idiopathic condition where the doctor doesn't know why is it happened and the patient doesn't know why is it happened and what should be done to cure it. Fortunately, the Bell's palsy is mostly recovers on its own. Now, what is Bell's palsy? Here, the Bell's palsy is a unilateral lower motor type of facial nerve paralysis, happening equally in both the sexes and a bit more frequent among the elderly. There may be a family history. The risk of Bell's palsy is more among the diabetes as also the pregnant patients. So, whenever there is no reason to justify why one disease has happened, various hypotheses come up. Some say it is a viral etiology, where there is a reactivation of the herpes virus residing in the geniculate ganglion. Others say it's the Epstein-Barr virus. So one cause is a viral infection where there is a demyelination. It may happen that there is a edema of the nerve, there is inflammation of the nerve, and the nerve is getting compressed. In which part? The most narrowest part of the facial nerve, the labyrinthine part. There may be a vascular ischemia, a primary or secondary. What is primary ischemia? When there is a ischemia, there is angiopathy, the capillaries are not carrying the flowing blood, the oxygen. What happens is that there is no nutrition to this nerve and the facial nerve gets damaged. What is secondary? Following this relative anoxia, there is increased capillary permeability. What happens is that there is further fluid in the part that where the event has happened, and the nerve part has undergone edema, thereby in the narrow canal getting compressed, resulting in facial nerve paralysis. So all this compression, as I have already told, is mostly is due to neuropraxia. Demyelination may also happen, but we have already discussed the prognosis of these two conditions are good, and hence Bell's palsy has got a good prognosis in the long run. There may be a hereditary cause also, commonly present in runs it runs in the families. A girl who is having a facial nerve paralysis, when he is having the facial nerve paralysis, her mother may come and say, "Oh, you are having a facial nerve paralysis. I also had it in my childhood days, in my youth, and don't worry, you're going to come out of it." So, what are the clinical features of the Bell's palsy? It is a lower motor type lesion. So, unlike the upper motor nucleus lesion, there will be absolute loss of function of the ipsilateral type, ipsilateral face. The frontal creases will go. There is white palpebral fissure. There is epiphora. Why will be there epiphora? Because the lacrimal secretion, the minimum that is happening, is not getting drained by the nasolacrimal duct. Why? The nasolacrimal duct has gone ectropion because there is poor muscle tone of the lower lid, and there is poor pumping action that may channel the lacrimal fluid into the nasolacrimal gland and duct. So there is epiphora. There is absence of the nasolabial fold, drooping of the angle of the mouth. Whenever the patient closes the eye, you can see the white sclera with the eyeball rotating outwards. The this is called the Bell's phenomenon. In normal individuals also, this Bell's phenomenon is happening. That is, the eyeball rotates upward whenever the patient closes his eyes. But we don't get to see this event because the eyes are closed. But in the facial nerve paralysis patient, as the eyes remain open, we can appreciate the eyeballs moving upward. There may be pain in the ear, noise intolerance. Why noise intolerance? The nerve to stapedius is not working. So, when there is a loud noise, you feel the effects of acoustic trauma. You feel the discomfort to the loud noise because you are not enjoying the protection of the stapedius muscle, contraction of the stapes muscle. Obviously, there is loss of function of the chorda and hence the loss of function of taste. How do you diagnose? It is mostly the diagnosis of exclusion. You do a radiology, CT MRI, you do electrodiagnostic tests, and you try to assess whether any pathology is present which is responsible. You do test for diabetes, and when we don't find any cause that is contributing towards this facial nerve paralysis, we stamp this case as a patient of Bell's palsy. And how do we treat? Obviously, assurance. As I have told you, it is a case, mostly case of neuropraxia. It is going to recover on its own in the long run, especially if it is an incomplete paralysis or where the recovery is starting within a duration of 3 weeks. You can be assured that all of the functions may return smoothly in the long run. But during that period, you need to give support to this patient. How? As because the eyes remain open, there is a high chance that this patient will get exposure keratitis which may become permanent. So during this time, you need to lubricate the eyes by putting in eye drops, the cellulose eye drops, methyl cellulose eye drops, as also during the night. So that there is no exposure keratitis, you need to strap the eyes, close the eyes tightly with adhesive tapes that will keep the eyes closed when the patient is sleeping. Other than this, you may also need to stimulate the facial muscles by doing passive exercises, or also the stimulating the facial nerve to get back some function onto the facial nerve, some function onto the maintain the function of the facial muscles. Other than this, what are the medical options that we have? We have already assured the patient, maybe we have given some analgesics for the pain that may have happened, but definitive drugs we may give if we are suspecting that it is a viral pathology. We may give antivirals. Steroid is a anti-inflammatory that will reduce the edema. If the edema is gone, the neuropraxia will cure and there will be return of function. Other possible options are the vasodilators, vitamins, mast cell inhibitors, and antihistaminics, but they haven't been found to be useful, but occasionally used by doctors expecting some effect. Do surgery hold a role? Yes, occasionally. If the electrodiagnostic test suggests that there is absolute degeneration, and if you don't do something very soon, chances that you will lose the nerve becomes very high. Doctor has to do a decompression operation of the facial nerve. So whenever there is a decompression operation, what happens is that the pressure on the facial nerve goes. With the pressure of the facial nerve going, the neuropraxia goes. And when the neuropraxia goes, there is a recovery of the facial nerve function. Which part to decompress? Obviously, the part that is within the bony canal needs to a decompression. That is the part within the intertemporal bone. Commonly, the part that are commonly decompressed are the tympanic and the mastoid part because they are easy to do. But perhaps the part that really needs to be done is the labyrinthine part, which is the narrowest part of the facial nerve and more prone to get compressed in cases of any edema happening to the facial nerve. There is a Melkerson-Rosenthal syndrome. Again, it is an idiopathic condition. There is a triad of facial palsy, lip edema, and fissures of the tongue. How do we treat it? Here also is because it is an idiopathic condition. The treatment is more or less similar to that of Bell's palsy, that is trying out anything and everything which you feel may benefit the patient. This is a relapsing condition. It may happen, recover on its own, reappear after some time, and occasionally some symptoms may remain, become permanent, like a permanent edema of the lips or some residual paralysis of the facial nerve. Herpes zoster oticus and Ramsay Hunt syndrome. Though in this slide, the term that should only be present is this Ramsay Hunt syndrome. Ramsay Hunt syndrome is nothing but herpes zoster oticus together with facial nerve palsy. Herpes zoster oticus, if it happens, will be causing herpetic lesions along the distributions of the facial nerve. Along the communicating branch, it will be causing vesicles and around the distribution of the facial nerves in the pinna. Also, there will be vesicles in the soft and the hard palate. But if compounded with the facial nerve palsy, it becomes Ramsay Hunt syndrome. So, herpes zoster oticus plus facial nerve palsy equal to Ramsay Hunt syndrome. Treatment is antiviral, steroids, and something similar to that of Bell's palsy. Fracture of the temporal bone, it can be longitudinal, longitudinal meaning along the axis of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Here the tympanic membrane may also be damaged because the fracture has extended up to the squamous part of the temporal bone. There is a transverse fracture may also happen, mostly when the impact is coming from behind. Here there is a transverse fracture along the petrous part of the temporal bone. This transverse fracture is more prone to cause immediate facial nerve paralysis demanding surgical intervention. The longitudinal nerve, usually the facial nerve gets spared. If it happens, it's mostly due to edema or hemorrhage, which occasionally resolves on its own. And if it is not resolving, you may need to do some decompression procedure. Occasionally, it is both longitudinal as also transverse when we call it a mixed fracture of the temporal bone. Treatment is either wait and watch or you may need to do a decompression surgery. Now we had known when to intervene and in which situation to intervene. But where the facial nerve has gone, where the facial nerve has got damaged, at which part of the facial nerve it is not functioning. Are there ways to measure it? Yes, there are ways to measure it which through the topodiagnostic tests. Before topodiagnostic tests, let me recapitulate. Suppose a patient has undergone a unilateral upper motor type of facial nerve paralysis, that is both the upper part of the face up to the orbicularis oculi are functioning, but any one side of the lower part of the face is not functioning, together with other symptoms of cerebrovascular accident. Where is the lesion? Yes, it is the contralateral precentral gyrus, the supranuclear palsy. This patient, when laughing or crying, will be having the normal facial nerve functions, normal facial nerve movements. Then suddenly you find a patient again with symptoms of CVA, but together with the facial nerve motor functions, what has gone is the lateral rectus is also paralyzed. Yes, where has it happened? It has happened, a CVA has happened in the pontomedullary junction, a region where the facial nerve loops the abducent nerve nucleus and comes out. So together both with the facial nerve and the facial nerve nucleus, the abducent nerve is also gone, and there is a mostly facial nerve muscle paralysis together with the paralysis of the lateral rectus. Then comes the greatest superficial petrosal nerve supplying tears. The lacrimal it supplies the lacrimal gland, so supplies the tears. How do? You do a Schirmer's test. The next nerve to come out is the stapedius nerve, nerve to stapedius. So, whenever when the lesion is, suppose the lacrimation is normal, but the discomfort to loud noise, the loss of taste sensation, and the facial muscle movement, the facial muscle movement are all lost, but the lacrimal function is preserved. Where is the lesion? The lesion is somewhere here. So the Schirmer test will be saying that yes, your lacrimal function is normal, but the stapedius nerve is damaged. Nerve to stapedius is damaged, so lesion is somewhere between the stapedius, the nerve where the from the point where the stapedius nerve to stapedius is arising, and the greater superficial petrosal nerve, that is the geniculate ganglion. Here lies the lesion. But suppose the lacrimal gland is also functioning, the stapedial reflex, that is the muscle functioning to protect the ear, is normally functioning. Both two are preserved, but what goes is the taste. And the lesion is somewhere here. All these are preserved, but only the muscles of facial expression are lost. The lesion is here. So this is how topodiagnostically you may diagnose which part of the facial nerve you need to explore if you are contemplating surgery, or at all it is in the brain of the patient which you cannot usually deal with doing any surgery on the temporal bone or outside. So what is Schirmer's test? The greater superficial petrosal nerve, after it supplies the pterygopalatine ganglion, will be supplying the lacrimal gland. If we present a strip onto the lower fornix, we wait for 5 minutes, and within that time, if 10 millimeter of the paper gets soaked, we know that the facial nerve is functioning adequately. If it is less than 5 millimeter, we can diagnose that the facial nerve is functioning abnormally. But obviously, you have to take in mind the other clinical conditions and exclude them. The conditions that cause the dryness of the eyes should be excluded before we do a Schirmer's test to diagnose a loss of function of the greater superficial petrosal nerve. This is the stapedial reflex, a reflex that protects the eyes from the onslaught of very loud noise, pulling the stapes outwards. So, whenever the loud noise is presented to one ear, not only the ipsilateral side, the stapes contracts, the contralateral side also contracts, and we can definitely measure it using an instrument called the tympanometer. Submandibular salivary flow test is a very uncomfortable test where the submandibular salivary glands needs to be cannulated, and thereafter you put a 6% citric acid or lemon juice onto the tongue. Definitely the patient will be starting to salivate. If to one side, if to the affected side, the flow of saliva is less than 45% compared to that of the other, you can diagnose that the patient is having a damage to the chorda tympani nerve. So once again, nerve to the lacrimal gland, nerve to the stapedius, nerve to the sublingual and the submandibular glands, and the motor fibers to the face. So gradually testing each function, you may locate where exactly the nerve has got damaged and proceed to treat the patient accordingly. What are the surgeries of the facial nerve? Whenever there is a edema or hemorrhage within the nerve, within the acme, that is within the canal of the nerve, the bony canal of the nerve, causing a compression of the facial nerve, what the nerve needs for a relief is a decompression. We do a mastoid surgery, we remove the mastoid surgery, we remove the covering of the fallopian canal, that is the canal covering the facial nerve, and release the pressure on the nerve. Suppose during an operation there is a sudden injury to the facial nerve. More than 30% of the facial nerve gets damaged. In such a situation, what you do? You do a end-to-end anastomosis. If more segment of the facial, a longer segment of the more than 1 meter of the facial nerve is lost, you need to do a cable grafting. Cable grafting is something that you take a nerve from other part of the body, you suture it or you place it in a bony groove in between the transected parts, expecting the nerve from the proximal damaged segment through the cable graft will grow into the distal damaged segment, thereby helping in returning in function of the facial nerve. So what are the cable grafts that are used? Commonly used are the greater auricular nerve as also the sural nerve. Suppose the nerve is thoroughly damaged. Maybe you have done a operation onto the CP angle, or there is a CP angle, or there is a CVA onto that part of the brain that gives rise to the facial nerve. You know that this nerve is never going to get regenerated. You know for certain, but still the muscles are active. The nerve channels, they're still alive. See, if you do something, if you can redirect another nerve into the facial nerve, the part of the facial nerve, you can hope to get back some functions. For example, in these situations, this is the hypoglossal nerve and this is the pes anserinus. And this is the hypoglossal nerve, this is the pes anserinus. What you do? You transect the hypoglossal nerve and you make a communication. Occasionally, it may be end to end, it may be end to side, or you split the hypoglossal nerve, part of it remains so that the tongue movement continues, and part you suture with that of the nerve of the facial nerve. But remember, here you have to move your tongue, make an effort to move your tongue to get the facial muscles moving. So, some other nerve stimulus you are redirecting onto the facial muscles, and that nerve needs to be volitionally stimulated to get some movement of the facial nerve. So after the operation, the patient undergoes some physiotherapy whereby he is trained to use his other nerve to stimulate the muscles of facial expression. So whenever he is trying to smile, he is actually simultaneously trying to move his tongue to get a closure of the eyes or a movement of the angle of the mouth, thereby giving some expression. There are certain conditions where the patient presents to the surgeon very late. Here, not only the muscle has got degenerated, the nerve also has got degenerated. In such a situation, what you can do? You can relocate a muscle or itself. You can translocate a muscle, make a sling attached to the muscles of facial expression. Suppose the temporalis muscle. You take the temporalis muscle and you do a sling attaching to the angle of the mouth, and the same sling can go to the muscles of the eye also. So whenever the patient wants to smile, wants to close his eyes, what he will be actually doing is actually clenching his mouth, thereby bringing in expression to his face. Another short question, a short note, or may be asked into the oral practical is crocodile tear. It is believed that the crocodile cries after making its kill. It is used as a proverb in English also, that whenever you are doing something wrong and crying even after doing this, you are a conning person. So that is called a crocodile tear. But what is a crocodile tear when you are studying facial nerve paralysis? It is called the gustatory lacrimation, and it is also known by the name of Bogorad syndrome. Suppose the patient has undergone a damage to the endoneurium or maximally the perineurium, most commonly the endoneurium, and the muscle has grown and the nerve has grown in a disordered manner. The regenerating nerve meant for the submandibular and the sublingual gland is getting directed to that of the nerve carrying fibers for the lacrimal gland. So in such a situation, what happens is that whenever the patient is chewing, he's taking his food, suddenly his eyes are getting watery. So you are eating your food and you are also crying. So crying during eating, something that perhaps only the crocodile can do, who cries after it has made its kill and is eating its prey, is called a crocodile tear, Bogorad syndrome, or gustatory lacrimation. How do you treat? If it is a mild case, you do counseling. Not to worry. It is not too much a bothersome symptom. You keep a napkin, you wipe your face, and that's all and that much. But if it is a severely problematic to the person, the best thing that can be done is a botulinum injection of the lacrimal gland. Does it get a permanent relief? The answer is no. It only gives a relief for only 6 months. Is there a surgery? Obviously, there will be a surgery. If they, by any method you can reduce the proportion of lacrimal secretion, definitely at the time of eating also, the lacrimation will be minimum and tearing will be less at the time of eating. So, after this lengthy class, thank you students, thank you for your patient hearing. I really regret the chance to meet you, the chance of physical classes where there is a personal communication with the students. I am going to place it in the YouTube so that it may remain as a reference to you for uh, future reference. Hopefully you like this class.